Today I want to talk about the voluntary city. That's the title they gave me. I gave a subtitle. Well, it was a voluntary city urban problems. And I thought, I want to talk about solutions too. So we're going to talk today about cities and why they're relevant to liberty and how actually they can really promote liberty. All right, who likes cake? So I had this idea that it'd be great to start out this talk with like a big cake. We could roll it out here and I would be inside and I would jump out. And I couldn't actually manage that. I guess, it was a bit much. So I made this for you. It's the cake. It's almost as good. All right, we're going to dress it up a little bit, the cherry on top. Why would I go to all the trouble to have a cake out here, and why would I leap out of a cake? It's all for the sake of this. Actually, this is a rhetorical question. It's all for the sake of this silly pun, because I'm going to be talking later about what some people have called leap zones, legal, economic, administrative, and political zones in Honduras. And also I'll be talking about a city they call Cake City for the King Abdullah economic city in Saudi Arabia. That's a picture of it there. But I'll be talking about this in a little bit. Just wanted to start with some cake. Let's talk about what we're going to talk about by way of preview. How can freedom help cities? Well, I think one of our first questions would be, who cares? Who cares about cities? I myself was kind of brought up a country boy. And maybe some of you think, cities, that's for slickers, I don't care. I think we should care about cities. I'll tell you why. We'll talk about the private sector and what it can do for cities. It can actually do a lot. You're going to be amazed, I think, at what cities can do with the private sector. And really, the question here is, can we make cities more voluntary? And I'll have some ideas for you about that. And the Independent Institute put out this book, The Voluntary City. So check out this book and other books I could point you to. But check out this book especially if you're interested in some of the themes that I'll be talking about today. Just wanted to give you that plug. So let's talk about why we should care about cities. I'm just going to throw some stats your way. First of all, over half of the human population now lives in cities. So if you like humans, I got a soft spot, you should care about cities because that's where most of the humans are these days. A lot of the world's economy is in cities. 100 top cities, 100 biggest cities in the world, 30% of the world economy. In 1980, Tokyo was, wow, big deal. Biggest city to hit 20 million. That's small potatoes these days. There are already nearly 100 million people in Mumbai and Shanghai, and there's more on the way. There are going to be 15 super cities. So think about that. Each one of these Chinese super cities, bigger than Tokyo was in 1980. Most of these, none of us have ever heard of. Your average American, I guess we have some Canadians here too, maybe you're from all over the world, almost anyone, unless they're from China, you tell them the name of one of these cities that's got already millions and millions of people think, what? I never heard of it. So that is the way of the future. By the way, Europe will have none of these super cities. That doesn't mean cities aren't important in Europe, but it does show that a lot of the action is taking place in Asia. And Asia is a big success story. We'll return to that later. So this is all good news, actually. So that's some facts about cities. This is a picture of a local minimum. A local maximum. A local maximum. A local maximum is when you have this little hill, you're on a place that's maybe better than the surrounding area, but it's only local. And you can maybe imagine better, higher places. Maybe you can't see them from where you are, but to get there, you got to go downhill. In a lot of ways, I think that's where we are now. The nation state is kind of this local maximum. Now, you may not even think it's a maximum, but we can all admit there's some nice things. I mean, even Professor Bailey had some not terrible things to say about how governments handle health care, but we're not sure how to get from there without going downhill. So is that the nation state? Well, so the nation state, I would argue, is actually kind of dissolving. This is happening all around us right now. And in America especially, you don't see this, but in other places you see it. And let me throw some stats your way to show you about this. In place of the nation state, we're starting to see the rise internationally of special economic zones. That's what SEZ stands for, special economic zones. And these come in a variety of flavors. There are free trade zones, there are economic processing zones, there are single factory EPZs. There are SEZs that are huge, like Cake City, that include residences. There are much smaller ones. The idea with all of these SEZs is that they are special jurisdictions where the usual rules do not apply. You don't see as many of these in the United States because I guess they haven't been seen as necessary in the United States. But in much of the developing world for a long time, they've been adopting SEZs as a way to encourage foreign investors to come to a country. So to just pick one country out of many that have SEZs, the Dominican Republic. They wanted to have some foreign investors come in and build factories and create employment. And foreign investors look at the Dominican Republic, nothing against the Dominican Republic, but it's not the first place you'd pick if you wanted to make money, invest a lot of stuff in factories. So the Dominican Republic said, hey, investors, come here to this SEZ and we'll give you some special rules, maybe lighter labor obligations, a different tax rate, no customs and duties for import and export. And investors say, well, that's not so bad, okay. And so this has really taken off. The first one of these was in Ireland, in Shannon, in 1959. Well, the first modern SEZ, we're going to see in a minute. I actually think that this is a return to historical precedents that go really back to the origin of the city. The first cities, in a way, were SEZs. But the modern SEZ got started in 1959, and look at this curve. Now, this is a number here. So, we're seeing an increase in the number of SEZs and similar zones in the world. We get up to 2014 here. There's thousands and thousands of these. Not so much in the United States. I'm actually working this summer on a paper about SEZs in the United States. There really aren't SEZs in the United States. We have analogous institutions. Well, they're much weaker. They're basically free trade zones. I could say more about it, but I won't get into it now. I'll just say, really, the United States is way behind this curve. I think that's going to change. That's what I'm working on this summer. This is that same data translated into percentage terms. And the interesting thing is here, look at this. We're approaching 100% of the countries in the world that have SEZs. So this is happening all over the world. In America, people don't talk about it. Actually, in a lot of these countries, people don't really talk about it because it's just something that happens down at the port. DuPont comes in and they build a factory and they have this little special regime. But, there's a few guys go in with hard hats every day. They work, they go home. It's creating some economic growth. Not a huge deal to them. But it is happening elsewhere in the world. What about in the United States? Now, here's what we have happening in the United States. Not so much special economic zones, but instead common interest communities. And these are things like homeowners associations, condominiums, cooperative residential communities, those kinds of places. And let me just see a show of hands. Anybody live in a place like that? If you live in Orange County where I live, you certainly do. Orange County is almost entirely these things, and these have really taken off in the United States. So again, we have some data here. So we're getting to about 25% of the people living in the United States living in one of these types of communities. Now, why am I including SEZs and these common interest developments in sort of the same talk? Because really, what's happening in these common interest developments is they are providing privately a lot of the same goods and services that municipalities provide elsewhere. So here in Berkeley, I walked over from my hotel downtown today, got to see some of Berkeley. You could do worse, I guess. Some trash in the streets, some kind of freaky looking people. That's all right. It's Berkeley. Well, the city of Berkeley, they get taxes. They spend it on roads and, sewage and taking care of homeless people and all kinds of stuff they do. If you live in a homeowners community, basically that is covered by your dues. Maybe you've got a community center you can go to. There's a pool. They may even have private security. Basically, these are private communities, and they are really big and getting bigger in the United States. And also, they are elsewhere in the world. I don't have data on that for you right now. I think you should keep your eyes open to the possibility that for a lot of these countries, that's the only way reform is going to happen. And what SEZs can do, the real virtue from the point of view of a friend of liberty, is it allows experimentation to happen in a local small area. You're not going to go to a place like the Dominican Republic and get them to lower customs duties for the whole country. Just ain't going to happen. Because there's people in the Dominican Republic who benefit from having high customs duties. It allows them to kind of keep the local populace buying their stuff. The imported stuff is more expensive. And so they like that. If you're a local sugar producer, you like that. So you're not going to get nationwide reforms. An SEZ actually leverages public choice problems. It leverages the self-interest of politicians. Basically, a politician discovers, hey, if I okay this little development down by the port, You know, I get more taxes. I'm okay with that. And it leverages that to allow a country to experiment with more free rules, lower taxes, less regulation. Now, I'm not saying politicians do this because in the goodness of their hearts, they want everyone to get more wealthy and more free. There are politicians like that. There are politicians not like that. But every politician cares about what? That politician. And so SEZs can serve as a way. Sure, sometimes it's just like back scratching and corruption and, you know, it's just like any other government program. But sometimes SEZs can really encourage reform because they allow experimentation in the only way it's going to happen in most countries. Little tiny isolated protected pockets. You can't take on the whole country at once. A lot of people think the way to reform a country is, I'm going to go to Washington. I'm going to get a law passed. And you're going to get from that, if you're lucky, a reform that's about an inch deep nationwide. So it's kind of a horizontal approach to reform. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying that's not what I'm interested in. And frankly, I think there's another way that deserves scrutiny, and that is vertical reform. You take one little place geographically and you say, here, let's do all kinds of interesting radical things. And the people who live over here kind of look at that and go, what do I care? That's the other side of the country. Doesn't affect me. So you can make it happen. And indeed, that has been basically the story with Hong Kong and China. I'll talk about that in a second. All right, let's carry on. So I'm going to suggest here we can move from the nation state to something better. So the nation state, remember, I argue, is kind of this local maximum. We don't know exactly what is up here. Let's start talking about maybe what we could get that's better than the nation state. And I think voluntary cities, or startup cities as they're sometimes called, charter cities, could be something better. So let's just take a look at this. What is this? This is a mall. You look at this and you see a mall, and so do I. I don't even know where this is. It could be any mall anywhere. The cool thing about a mall, when you think about it, is it's a lot like a city. It really is. Of course, it's all privately provided, though. Why is it like a city? Well, here you've got, you know, kind of like streets. This is where people walk around. You've got these parks, these common areas. You've got fire protection. There's probably sprinklers up here. See them? Sprinklers. They have security at the mall. You can get food at the mall. I guess you can't really sleep in a mall. So there are as many people working in many malls, using them every day, as in many small cities. And privately, they're providing many of the same services you get in the cities, right? These stores are kind of like addresses. They you know, separate residences on a street. They got almost everything you could have in a conventional political municipality. This is all by the way of showing you that, you know, people say, well, who will build the roads? That's easy. What's a road? There's hardly any technology in that. You know, you have grade and you compact and you put down a bed of gravel and you put some asphalt on the top and you paint stripes. That's easy stuff. We should be asking who will build the cities. And we already have those people. They're doing it now. This is a casino mall, another good example. And here actually, again, you think about it, they've got public transport. It's vertical because you take the elevator, but it's kind of like you go down to the BART. The BART is horizontal. The elevator is vertical. So people are getting public transport in here up and down these buildings. You can get food there. You can get entertainment there. You can get housing there, of course. Basically, they have security, fire protection. They have banks in there. They have places of worship. A lot of people praying for luck inside of casinos. And so this is just an example of how, yeah, you know, people who think, oh, no, the private sector, are they going to be able to provide, you know, public transport and parks and police? They're already doing it. You just have to open your eyes to that. Another example. This is the largest enclosed space in the world. It's the Boeing factory in Everett, Washington. And why is it remarkable? Well, it's just another example of how the private sector can provide essentially cities. About 30,000 people work in this place. They have banks, they have child care centers, they have roads inside on which people on bicycles and on electric cars transit. They have their own train station, they have their own water treatment plant, they have their own fire department. The private sector can do all this stuff that municipalities do. They really can. They're already doing that. They have restaurants in here. They have almost everything except residences. But there are factory complexes, especially in China, that even have residences and grocery stores and pharmacies on site. Now, I'm not sure. I want to live there. These are places like Foxconn. Sorry if I just banged your ear there. Places like the Foxconn plants in China. I don't know that any of us would want to live there. But for many of the Chinese workers living there, it's better than what they had before. And they live on site, they live in dorms, they work in the factory, they go hang out at a coffee shop with their friends in the evening. It's very much like a city, all privately provided. This is a homeowners association, Highland Park, Colorado. And although I've heard different accounts, this is arguably the largest homeowners association in the United States, and therefore maybe, probably in the world, although China is doing some huge private developments now, really huge. But this is a very large one in the United States. Let me see if I can remember the numbers on this. It has, yes, over 30,000 homes. There's also apartments, but you can see here some of the homes. Over 90,000 residents. This is all privately owned, right? This is a homeowners association. Your parents might live in something like this. This is just scaled up. Everything here is part of Highland. They have their own schools. You see the school bus there? They have their own schools. This is all like a big shopping area. All this stuff privately provided. You've got roads. You've got parks. Everything a municipality does, fire stations, these folks in Highland Park, Colorado can do. I really like this example. Let's talk a little bit about this one. Now, this is a co-op, a cooperative residential community. This is the largest co-op in the world that I found so far. It's in Bronx, New York. It's called Co-op City. Basically, everything you're seeing here, not this stuff in the background, but all these buildings are part of Co-op City. And it has over 50,000 residents. It is, by the way, solidly middle class. 25% of Hispanic origin. They have about a fifth of them are over 60. A lot of elderly live here. Now, I will concede that's in part because the state of New York offered subsidies. So I'm not sure, without that, it would be exactly the same demographic mix. But it does show that you don't have to be a rich person to live in one of these communities. And what are some of the features of this? The most interesting feature I'll save to the last, but let's talk about some of the other features. They have this educational complex here. You can see the track. So they have their own schools here. They have 3 elementary schools, 2 middle schools, and a high school, all for these over 30,000 people that live here. They have 3 shopping districts, and these shopping districts have their own grocery stores, dry cleaners, offices, places like doctors' offices, CPAs, that kind of thing. There are, if I'm not mistaken, something like 15 houses of worship, all on site. Of course, they have roads. Who will build the roads? Dude, they've done that, okay? They got sidewalks, parking lots, landscaping, swimming pools. They have a flippin' planetarium. Does your homeowners association have a planetarium? I guess it's for the kids at the schools. So basically, this is as large as a pretty big town in the places I grew up out in the sticks. And now all that's interesting enough, okay? Here's the really interesting thing about co-ops, and we'll return to this later. It's a really interesting feature. Well, in homeowners, let me take a step back. In homeowners association, how does that work? You own your home, and when you buy your home, as part of the purchase, you agree to a covenant of conditions. So, you say, when I move into Shady Tree Estates, I agree, I'm going to own my home, but I can't paint it pink. I have to use one of these 4 colors of beige on the exterior of my home. And I can't leave my work truck parked out front. I have to put it in the garage. And I have to keep my yard mowed. And you basically bind yourself to all these limitations. Because why? Well, you may not like being limited. You may really love to have a pink house, but you realize, well, I don't want to live next door to a purple house. This guy next door builds a purple house and he doesn't mow his yard. My property values decrease. So people in homeowner associations basically bind themselves to these mutual commitments to uphold the value of the property. It's a very conservative kind of thing to do. Conservative not in a political sense, but in the small c sort of being prudent sense. Condominium associations, cooperative residential associations are different. Every one of the people, so we'll just, here's a little apartment right there. The person living in that apartment has a lease. They rent their apartment from the co-op. So how is that any kind of how is it owned by the people who live there? The people who live there own the corporation that owns the buildings. All right, so this is a little kind of weird, but it's kind of a big circle. If you live in this, You own a share in the corporation that owns all this. So a big corporation, it's not publicly traded. It's a special kind of corporation, but it is a private organization in which the property rights are distributed among shareholders. And if you're a shareholder, you have a vote. And essentially, that's how they govern this community. You move in, and you say, oh, I want to be a member. They say, great. You have to buy a share in the corporation, just like you might buy a share of Apple. You buy a share at Apple, you have the right to vote on the board of directors. You buy a share in the corporation that owns this whole community, and you get to vote on the board of directors. You get to vote for somebody on the board of directors. So it's just like that, except that you're living in the corporation that you own. Because when you move into your apartment, you write your rent check, it goes to Co-op City. And then this board of directors helps distribute the funds. I'm going to take a breath here. That's a little confusing. Is that kind of make sense? Is that all right? All right. All right. So I think these residential cooperative communities are really interesting as a model for purely private cities. And we'll say more about that in a little bit. Let's say a little bit. I'm just going to roll out. A lot of this talk is just rolling out examples. Maybe it's not as hard for you guys, but I run into audiences who go, oh, well, private parties can't, a private city? What? This crazy talk. That's actually the world a lot of us already live in. I'm trying to get your eyes open to that. This is happening now. Now, this is like a computer simulated version of what they hope to have in Cake City. They're not there yet. They built some stuff down here. They got the port up and running. It's already one of the larger ports on the Red Sea. This is, by the way, if you're curious where this is, it's in Saudi. It's on the Arabian Peninsula. It's on the west side, on the Saudi side of the Arabian Peninsula. Dubai, which I'll talk about in a second, is on the other side of the Arabian Peninsula, okay, over on the Persian Gulf. So anyhow, what's going on in Saudi Arabia? Well, Saudi Arabia has for years been building these cities, these new cities. They're trying to get their people modernized into modern housing, and basically they have a burgeoning population. And so the Saudi government has been building these kind of big planned communities. Government built and run, and those have been, they've had mixed results with that. Cake City is interesting because they basically have handed off all of the development onto the private sector. The Saudis kind of blocked out this area, and they said, come here and build this so that our people can live here, private sector. And the party who gave this talk, this is from YouTube. I gave you the information here so you can look it up yourself. Fahid al-Rashid gave a talk at Stanford, this is pretty recently, where he talked about this. He's basically the guy in charge of the company that's building Cake City, and he claims it is the largest private sector development in the world to date. That's what he claims. And I believe they expect it's going to cost close to $100 billion. They're at $86 billion now, but it'll probably go up. Huge, huge project, all privately funded and built and managed and run. And it's going to be basically the size of a Washington, D.C. when they're done. Now, I don't want to pretend any of this is libertarian, nirvana. I'm not presenting any of these as, wow, this is going to save the world and we should all move there. Probably especially not this. I don't know, actually. I want to learn more about Cake City. They're still building it. We'll find out. But it does show the private sector can what? Can build cities. The governance here is something I think they're still figuring out. Certainly, I'm still trying to figure it out. It looks like it's going to have some features like an SEZ. Basically, right now, as far as I've been able to discern, see, they don't have a lot of people actually living there yet. So we're not really sure how it's going to pan out. And in fact, I believe that Al-Rashid has said to the people, he doesn't say it in this talk, but other people he's been talking with, he's basically said, look, we really don't know what's going to work. They're inviting a lot of experimentation. There's these separate neighborhoods, and they're inviting kind of experimentation within their community, different models of governance, so they can find something that works. I really salute that. This Al-Rashid guy is very humble, at least publicly, when he says how things are going to work. He says, I really don't know. That's not my job. My job is to set up kind of a playground or a petri dish where we can run these experiments and pick credible people to basically try different things, and we'll figure it out as we go along. So they have a few kind of lighter regulations, like easier licensing requirements. Maybe at the port over here they're going to have lower custom duties. We don't know exactly how far they'll take the experimentation. But it's very promising, and it does show that the private sector can do amazing things. This is one of the largest developments anywhere in the world these days. So that's Cake City and Saudi. Let's talk about these special jurisdictions historically. As I noted, all right, you can go back to Shannon, Ireland, and say in 59 it was the first SEZ, and in some sense that's true. But I think if you go back further in history, you'll see that these special economic zones, these more generally special jurisdictions, they really work. They really work well. Anybody heard of the Hanseatic League? Really interesting example of basically, well, it was kind of a private government. What we had here, these were all of these different places were cities in the, that's the High Middle Ages. And basically, the Hanseatic League was a network of cities, kind of loosely governed, but it's more like a federation. And these were basically trading cities. They traded things like salted cod and balsam and pine, and mostly commodities. And they were tough, the people who ran these cities. They're basically merchants in a time when to be a merchant meant you had to fight pirates. In fact, these people in these cities fought the king of Sweden and beat him. My Swedish friends don't like that, and they like for me to add, which I will add, that eventually the king of Sweden beat them. But for a while there, these commercial cities, basically a confederation of commercial cities, gave a really good run. They basically, I would argue, saved Europe from the Middle Ages. It was thanks to the Hanseatic League, this confederation of more or less private cities. None of them really, well, they were nominally under the control of the Holy Roman Empire. But if you know your history, you know in this era, the Holy Roman Empire was basically powerless. It was pretty powerless. They didn't have much control at all. So basically, they went their own way, and they did really well. They helped Europe get through the Dark Ages, which is no small thing. Let's talk a little about Hong Kong and China. I alluded to this earlier. I would argue, people say they worried in 97 that China was going to take over Hong Kong. And to take a step back, in 1841, the British established Hong Kong. And so here is China, and there's where Hong Kong is. Just this little tiny dot there. It really is quite small. And here is Hong Kong, not very big at all. Note here Shenzhen. You've probably heard about Shenzhen across the border from Hong Kong. But so the British established Hong Kong in 1841, and it was amazing because they basically said, because it's more or less under British control, British rules, English rules are going to apply here. So they had respect for property rights, they upheld contracts, they applied the common law, and it was this little kind of corner of the world that had English law in Asia. And what happened? It thrived. Before the Chinese took over, Hong Kong had some years the highest per capita income in the world. Now this was in, the 70s and 80s. And I'll remind you, in the 60s and 70s, across the border in China, you had Mao's regime. We'll talk more about that later. I'll give you some numbers on Mao's regime. Basically, in Mao's regime, people were starving. They were literally eating grass to survive. People starved by the tens of millions under Mao's regime, and they could look over the fence, more or less, into Hong Kong, and there's the highest per capita income in the flippin' world, right across the fence. Now, why is that? Different climate? No. Different people? No. Basically, you had a little tiny thin layer of British people in Hong Kong, and then almost all of it was Chinese. Culturally, Chinese. All the people there doing the hard work, making the money, Chinese. So it's not like the people there are any different. What's different? Their legal system. And the Chinese were not idiots. So along came Deng Xiaoping, and he looked over the fence and he said, okay, this is nuts. Over here, we're just scraping by. We're almost starving. Over the fence, because they have different rules, they are thriving. Now look, we got our problems with capitalism, but we also have our problems with starving to death. So let's try adopting some of these rules. So people say, so 97 rolls along, the British took over in 41. They basically signed this long lease that claimed they were going to give up power in 1997, and the date came up, and they basically handed it over to the Chinese and said, okay, there you go. And everyone was worried, oh no, the Chinese are going to take over Hong Kong. Well, they have changed things there, but essentially what has happened is, I would argue, Hong Kong has taken over China. You see that, yeah. A great book on this, if you're a fan of this stuff. Ronald Coase, you heard of the Nobel Prize winner Ronald Coase? I think this is probably his last book. He co-wrote with a guy, Wing, about basically how, I think the thesis of that book is largely how Hong Kong took over China, ideologically. And you now see in China all these special economic zones, and they also have these economic and technical development zones. And they spread, initially it was just across the river. The first experiments were in Shenzhen, which was initially, now it's this huge burgeoning metropolis with this network of cities with tens of millions of people. In 97, that was a fishing village and not much was going on. And so basically the Chinese said, let's try some of this free market-ish stuff in the rest of China and see what happens. And what happened? Greatest success story economically in modern times. Freer, I won't say free, but freer markets and more respect for property rights has lifted tens of millions of people in China out of poverty. They now have kind of a lower middle class existence. I mean, you and I probably would find it kind of bare bones, but for them, remember, 1970s and 60s, dying of starvation. Now in China, people are buying washers and dryers and televisions, and it's just a wonderful success story. We in America, I think, in Canada and other parts of the developing world, because we already were at kind of the high end of the curve, we've missed, too many of us, the big changes that are happening in the world out there. My last talk today is sort of the future of liberty, and I'll say, actually for us here in the developed world, I think it's great. For people in the developing world, it's really great. Those are the people that used to be starving. They are now reaching middle class levels. It's just a beautiful, wonderful thing. We don't get the benefit so much ourselves directly, but you should feel good about that. You really should. Here's Dubai, another kind of mixed case. Dubai, I mentioned, is on the opposite side of the Arabian Peninsula from Cake City. Dubai's been around longer. And Dubai's really interesting because there they decided in the United Arab Emirates, it's Emirates plural because the Emirates are actually, it's a very kind of loose confederation. And in this particular emirate, in Dubai, they decided, they looked around and they said, man, we got a lot of sand, it's really hot, we're living under Sharia law, it's kind of hard to get people in the developed world to come spend a lot of money here. What can we do? They can't change the weather. They're not really going to change their culture. I'll get to you in a second. What they did was they said, we're going to set aside a little corner of our country and we're going to have here different economic rules. In fact, what they did was, well, it's a little more complicated than this, but the simple version of what they did is they said, we're going to import English law because it worked over in Hong Kong. We're going to do that here in Dubai. And so basically they set up a special legal system where they said, you come to Dubai and you invest here, you set up your bank or your trading facilities or whatever, you will live under English law. Not the Sharia stuff. No. I mean, if you want to live under Sharia law, we got that too. But if you want to live under English law, you can do that in Dubai. And we got other nice things, low income taxes, streamlined regulations, and it worked. It worked in the sense that they had all this development. Now, here's the thing I don't like about Dubai. They have not treated their immigrant workers very well. There's been a lot of documented abuse of the people who are building these buildings mostly and who are working as maids and, landscapers and stuff. Those people are not being treated right. Their human rights are being violated. Even there, those people will tell you, sometimes at least, don't send me back to the Philippines. I need to work this really crummy job so I can send remittances back home to my people. So even there, we want to be careful. You could walk in and say, shut it all down. I think the thing to do here is reform. All right, so there's Dubai, another example of basically a special economic zone where what's interesting about Dubai is they imported the rules. They basically said, we got a bunch of sand here. Nobody wants to live here. No one wants to invest here. What can we do? We're going to import rules that people like to this place. And then whoop, that attracted people. The right rules attract. So more about special economic zones. The World Bank put out this study. I want to share something interesting with you. I've been talking about SEZs. Dubai was basically a public SEZ in the sense that the emirate said, we're going to set up these special rules. Well, that's not the only way to do it. You can have the private sector. We've already seen private sectors can build basically cities. Private sector developers can build and run SEZs as well. And the World Bank has studied this. There's lots of interesting data here. Let's focus on this. So here's public SEZs and private ones. Look at this. There are almost twice as many private SEZs in the world as there are public ones. That's kind of remarkable. Most people think, an SEZ is a government program. Well, there's obviously legislation behind it. But very frequently, the lawmakers kind of pass the rules. And they say, well, you can set up an SEZ in our country. You want to do it? Private party, come make an application, and we'll let you take the ball and run with it. And that is the majority approach around most of the world. Here's another thing to notice. As I told you earlier, Americans miss out on this. This is the Americas, all of the Americas. Most of these SEZs are in Central America. Honduras is one of the leaders. Dominican Republic has a bunch too. But most, look at this. In Asia and the Pacific, look how many more zones there are. Or look over in this column, if you will. Not that many in sub-Saharan Africa, but really, the Americas, which is not North America, is really lagging behind some of these other places. So it's a worldwide phenomenon. We in the developed world don't notice it, and the private sector is really in the lead in running these SECs. Why? Why are there so many private zones? For the simple reason that they work. The World Bank studied this, and they said they're less expensive to develop and operate, and they yield better economic results. Even politicians can see that, right? As we discussed earlier, what's in it for the politicians? Well, frequently they say, I kind of like graft. Well, if there's more money sloshing around because the private sector runs things more efficiently, you can buy off the politicians. They get a bigger check. They're happy. That's not the way I'd want to do business. And there's U.S. federal laws that would forbid that. But that is the way it works in much of the world. More money sloshing around, the private sector can do that. It makes the politicians happier. So Honduras is a place that I've done a little bit of work. They have a really interesting program. I earlier presented this as the LEAP zones. That's what some people call these. This is the other name. Zones for Employment and Economic Development. And basically the Hondurans have said, man, we need to help out our country. We want to allow private sector developers to develop parts of our country that are basically super SEZs, where not only are there special tax and regulatory rules, but basically the private parties who start these zones can choose their rules and implement them. They're basically going to be privately run and privately governed zones. Privately run and governed zone. This is the future in Honduras, maybe. Honduras is an interesting case. I could go on and on about that. I've worked with a couple clients down there now. We're hoping things will happen. We'll see about that. Right now, I want to present just one idea to you about how we can make cities better and freer. These are cats. These are unowned cats. They're in a pound. They're hoping to be adopted. Now the question for you is, would you rather be there or here? Yeah, I know it's a cheap shot for me to do this. But it's true. These cats are cared for. They got a mama looking after them. That is an owned cat. And someone owns this cat. Put her in a box with a blanket. She's being taken care of. Those cats, they're in cages, okay? And that's the problem with cities. The problem with cities is that they're not owned. You brought up Detroit, one of you earlier. What's the problem with Detroit? Nobody gives a damn. There's garbage on the street. It's not my problem. I don't own this place. I'm just trying to get the hell out of here. Okay? Does that happen in a condominium or a homeowners association? I'm not saying they never have trash, but you're much more likely, if you live in Co-op City in the Bronx, if you see trash, to think, man, this is affecting my property values. What is this? You take care of it because you own it. People take care of stuff they own, and I think we should do that with cities. Well, how can you own a city? Co-op City does it just fine. So we can imagine city-sized private communities. We know the private sector can do this, where everyone living in the city owns a piece of the city. And that opens up all kinds of interesting governance structures. For example, I like this idea. We could have a system where the longer you live in the city, the more shares you own. Like every year you live in the city, we vest you with another share. The cool thing about that is, you live in a place for a while, you go, oh man, I'm a real Berkeley resident. Like these newcomers, these kids. That's what the locals think when they see us walking through. You don't really live here. Well, it'd be cool if these people really know something about how to run a city. Give them more votes. Why not? They'd be more invested in their city. So here's the hard problem. Maybe we're in this local maximum. We can imagine a better world. How do we get from here to there? That's the thing that consumes me. In fact, I started a private company, Archimediate LLC, and I advise people working in this field. Not going to say any more about that, but I'll just let you know. Smart, ambitious people are working on these problems, interesting problems. I hope some of you will join me someday in solving them. Let's just recap. How can freedom help cities? Well, we should care about cities. I mean, we're actually in a city right now. Most of the world lives in cities. Even a country hick like me lives in a city. That's where the action is. That's where freedom's going to make a difference. We've seen the rise of private providers of governing services. I like to think of it as government, it's just a service industry. It happens to be monopolized more or less right now, but it's just a service industry, just like you get your clothes cleaned. It would be terrible if the government was the only place you could have your clothes cleaned. Luckily, we have the free market there. Let's make other services more free market. And we've talked about how to make cities more voluntary. Some reforms, I think having more ownership of cities, more implementation of SEZs, which are privately run and operated, especially in that Honduran model, where they have the power to import the rules that their people want. So you can have experimentation with different rules, and it'll give people more choice in the systems of governance that they live under. So that's what we talked about, and with that, I'll stop and say thank you.